Good morning, everyone. And what a great morning it is. We're towards the end of the 14th Annual Shepherd Symposium on Social Justice, and I wanted to thank you for being here. For those of you who were here earlier in the symposium, you've already seen this PowerPoint, so I apologize, but it has a list of all of our sponsors and people who made the Shepherd Symposium happen this year. And so, as you can see, we have sort of a new look. The posters were put together by Jenny Venn, who's a graphic arts designer and a faculty member in the College of Arts and Sciences. And all of the cardboard that was used for the posters was actually from dumpsters. And so nothing new was used or created, and the students learned how to silkscreen. They also silkscreened our shirts. And so hopefully you saw these around campus. It's a part of our eco-justice theme, which we're very proud to say that we really tried to not use very many new materials this year in an effort to sort of reduce our footprint for our symposium. A couple other posters that I'd like to point out are for the Earth Day event that will be happening on campus on April 21st. And there are additional posters on that table if you'd like to take one and publicize it wherever your workspace is or your living space is. And also tonight we have the Equality Dance that is put on by the Matthew Shepard Foundation. There's our representative, Thomas Howard, in the back. It will be in this very room. It's a coordinated effort by the Matthew Shepard Foundation as well as the Shepard Symposium on Social Justice. It'll start at 8 o'clock. There'll be a live performer for about 30 minutes named Catastrophe that has been brought in by Spectrum, a group of students here on the UW campus, and Keith Reynolds, their advisor, is here in the audience. So we also thank Keith for their planning for the great event which will happen tonight at 8 o'clock. That's sort of the final event of the Shepherd, but we do have an event after our Endnote, and that is the Awakening the Dreamer workshop. It's going to be put on from 1 to 5 p.m. in the family room, which is the room to the west of me. It's 1 to 5 p.m. We're so thankful that the two presenters who are going to be giving that workshop will be here for 1 to 5. We blocked out some schedule for them. The mission of Awakening the Dreamer workshop is bringing forth an environmentally sustainable, spiritually fulfilling, and socially just human presence on planet Earth. So we thought that it tied in directly with the theme of the symposium, which is eco-justice. We would not have been able to be here today without the generous support of the Office of the President and from an anonymous donor who over 10 years ago gave a huge amount of money to the university. He was an elderly man. We don't know his name. He was not a graduate from UW, but he worked for the Union Pacific Railroad and was from Wyoming, and he invested quite wisely, which I wish I could say the same about myself. But he was a lover of the film and arts, and when Matthew Shepard was brutally murdered, the donor was particularly disturbed by the senselessness of the loss. Matthew Shepard was a UW student. This anonymous donor gave a large gift to the university to endow the Matthew Shepard Symposium as well as other diversity endeavors on campus. In addition, we had some sponsors from campus as well as from off campus who also gave monies and in-kind donations to help support the symposium this year. This is just a group of them, as well as the next slide. The WS is for Women's Studies, and all of the other logos are self-explanatory. Again, without their help, we would not have been here today. I'd like to also thank the Shepherd Symposium committee members. This committee is made from people from all over campus and the community, and without them, it definitely would not have happened. So if you are a member of the steering committee, would you please stand one last time? And I'd like to thank them. They are amazing support for me as the chairperson. So I'd like to read a quote from a woman who was going to be one of our keynote speakers on Wednesday night, Dr. Vandana Shiva. Sadly, she was unable to attend because of an emergency in India. And so she wrote the book Earth Democracy, which some of us read in preparation for her visit. And we are actually in negotiations with the Good Meal Project here on campus, as well as Dr. Shiva, for possibly having Dr. Shiva come present here on campus in October. But a quote that spoke to me from her book was that the human spirit, inspired by justice and environmental protection, can never be fully repressed. Let me read that again. The human spirit, inspired by justice and environmental protection, can never be fully repressed. So we as a community, people who have been coming to the Shepherd Symposium for many years, and those of you who are new to the symposium this year, I hope that you see us as a community and us going forward to help with justice and environmental protection for those people who might not have voices, for those people who have been marginalized on these important issues. I'd like to introduce Angela Jaime, who will become, as soon as this Endnote is over, the chairperson for the 2011 Shepherd Symposium on Social Justice. She's a colleague of mine in the College of Education, and I welcome her to the podium.
Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Yay! Excellent. Well, I wanted to do a couple things. Wanted to announce that we are definitely looking at next year's title, tentative title, or subject to be Social Interactions, Race, Class, and Gender. So we will have a definite title for you later on in the year. We as a committee usually meet a couple times during the summer, unfortunately. But nonetheless, we do. The committee is made up of wonderful, dedicated people, so we will definitely have something. So mark your calendars and tell everyone, beginning of April, early April, next year we'll have the symposium again. It'll be excellent. So as a thank you for coming to the Shepherd Symposium, I have a little surprise for you. I'd like you to look underneath your chair. There may be a card taped to the bottom of your chair. If so, please come forward and accept your endowment. Oh, and you really have to look. There's 3 out there. So if you're not sitting in the chair, look to the chair next to you. Yay, we got a winner. Come on up. What's your name? Jessica. Congratulations. Oh, what is in there, you ask? Well, let me tell you. Sharpie pens, because they're an incredible sponsor for us this year. And these are valued Sharpie pens, I might add, because the committee is about to scratch each other's eyes out to get them. All the leftovers, right? A wonderful calendar from the Anti-Defamation League, 3 months in, but nonetheless still very useful. And a coffee travel mug from the College of Education with a bunch of goodies inside. And a couple more pens. So, where's my other 2 winners? Woohoo! And there should be one over in that general area, probably behind Ben and Keith. You really have to look for them because there's taped underneath. There's one over in this area somewhere. Y'all might need to get on your knees and look. I know, yeah. I'm really trying here, people. Hey, we got another winner! What's your name? Riley. Riley? Oh, you can keep that. I actually wrote something on the inside of that. Riley, congratulations. Come on, people, over here. Look under your chairs. I ain't going to tell you which one it is, but... Man, I've never had to prod people to win a gift so hard before. Excellent! Woohoo! Your name, young lady? Annie. Andy? Annie. Annie. Congratulations, Annie. Enjoy. So thank you very much for coming to the Shepherd Symposium this year. Our keynote is going to be incredible. One last piece of business I'm going to do as the incoming chairperson of the Shepherd Symposium is that it's tradition that we always honor and thank our fearless leader. Yeah, be prepared. We've gone to great pains to make sure that this has been a secret, but I know you're in on it already. Because there's a couple times I'm like, damn, I think she saw. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Kate and the dedication that she's had to this committee. She's been serving on this committee, and I was asking you these questions before, served on this committee for 8 years and has been chair of the committee for 3 years. Like how I got that information out again? Yeah. And there's just a few things that I want to say on behalf of the committee. I think that I don't speak for them, but I think that they would all agree with me in that she is completely dedicated to this cause, to this symposium, to the justice. Don't start. She's extremely respectful. We always have a place at the table. We always have a voice. She's thoughtful in the way that she puts our agendas together. Our green room is stocked with everything that you could possibly think of that we would need to put this 3 days on. She's very professional. She's always making connections, networking, working with people. I can't even look at her. She's going to make me cry. She's always very thoughtful in every single act that she does for this particular cause and in anything that she does in her life. She's been so supportive of each and every one of us and so supportive of the Matthew Shepard Foundation, of the spirit of the Shepard Symposium, that it's been incredible to work with her. And caring. She's absolutely caring in every single step of every day that she steps forward. But above all, she is an advocate. She's an advocate for the justice, for the lack of voice that some do not have or can't have. And we just really, really want to thank her for all the work that she's done and all the time and effort that she's put into every Shepard Symposium that she's been a part of. And just because she'll be up at the Teton Science Center School for the next year, and of course that puts a lot of anxiety in my mind right now, she will be only a phone call away. So please help me and the committee to say that we know that we have unlimited admiration and appreciation for you, and help me thank her right now.
I'm not going to read the card because I will definitely cry, which I'm already crying, so thanks a lot for that.
We wanted to make sure that you had a relaxing moment after the
symposium. A 90-minute massage. I'm kind of excited about that. Thank you.
And this particular piece is created for and by the Love and Pride program that is directly related to the Shepard Foundation. The necklace says,
understanding, tolerance, and acceptance.
Understanding, tolerance, and acceptance.
And
compassion in the circles that are intertwined together, which sums up Kate. Now let her say a few words.
Yeah, great. Okay. Deep breaths. Thank you, everyone. It has been my pleasure. I'm going to get you. And all of you, but thank you. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Jessica Smith as our Endnote speaker. Jessica Smith holds a PhD in anthropology and a certificate in women's studies from the University of Michigan, and is currently teaching a seminar on the anthropology of energy at the University of Colorado, which I'll say softer, and at the University of Wyoming. Her UW students, which I am one, and I'm proud to say that her class on the anthropology of energy has been one of the most educational classes that they have had the opportunity to participate in. Jessica is a native daughter of Wyoming, born and raised here in our resource-rich state. Her research in Wyoming and Peru traces the commodity networks that surround mined materials and implicate a wide range of actors, from miners and corporate officials to ranchers and conservation activists. Within these networks, she focuses on the questions of gender, kinship, language, and responsible capitalism. Her research has been funded by institutions such as the National Science Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. In her EndNote remarks, Dr. Smith will address the oftentimes tenuous relationship between energy development and environmental social justice. Specifically, what can the experiences of oil, coal, and coal bed methane booms in Wyoming teach us about the social and environmental implications of rapid development? What human and ecological factors contribute to comparatively positive and negative local outcomes? What are the possibilities and limitations of extending insights from Wyoming to other contexts? At the heart of her comments is an appeal to recognize the dispersed and sometimes concealed networks that connect the people and places where energy is produced and consumed. I'd like to personally thank Jessica for being here. I have seen her at very many sessions throughout the symposium, so I'm looking forward to her EndNote comments. Dr. Smith, thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate, and thank you to the entire committee for inviting me to participate. I just want to offer you my wholehearted congratulations on the conference. It's been inspiring to be here and spend this time with you. So energy development has become a flashpoint for debate about environmental and social justice around the world, especially as it concerns indigenous communities. Many of us began these last few days of reflection about environmental social justice by attending the Good Mule screening of Crude, a film that paints a grim picture of oil development in Ecuador, one of Latin America's largest exporters behind Venezuela. The oil sector dominates the Ecuadorian economy, accounting for almost half of all total export earnings and 1/3 of all of its tax revenues. Yet the benefits from oil production rarely reach the people who suffer the most in this production. As the filmmakers document, the most prominent conflict surrounds installations in the Amazonian rainforest, which were originally established by Texaco in the 1960s. To make their already substantial profits greater, Texaco intentionally used outdated yet cost-cutting technologies that have created an environmental catastrophe that experts dub the rainforest Chernobyl. When the company left the country in 1992, it left behind at least 1,000 OPIC toxic waste pits, which leak into the water table and pollute rivers and streams that people depend on for drinking, cooking, bathing, and fishing. Moreover, the company dumped more than 18 billion gallons of toxic formation waters, which are a byproduct of drilling into local rivers, and which is a practice that is outlawed in all U.S. states that also have these industries. For the past 3 decades, residents have been exposed to pollution and toxins on a daily basis, resulting in elevated cancer rates and other illnesses. Chevron, which has since taken over Texaco, counters that the liability for cleaning up rests with the government and with the state-run oil company, not them. The case has been languishing in court, all the while the indigenous communities who have endured the greatest burdens from this development wait for justice from a state that has historically marginalized them as well. More recently, to give you an update, when another oil field was slated to be developed in a different part of the Amazon, local residents feared that similar environmental and social disasters would follow, and so they organized themselves into a militant indigenous resistance movement to hold the company accountable for their first efforts at development. So in my seminar here at the University of Wyoming, which I'm so pleased to be able to do, we read anthropologist Susanna Sawyer's work with the group, and she documents the difficulties that they faced in confronting an alliance between the Ecuadorian government and the oil company. The government actually facilitated the division of their communal lands into individual parcels that could then be alienated. And then the company made really sweet deals with the people who had their parcels next to where they needed to be. and then they supported them in making a second indigenous movement that was funded completely by the company. The larger group, which holds 20,000 members compared to the less than the 100 that are allied with the pro-oil organization, are worried that the impacts of oil development, such as spills and the loss of habitat, will not be confined to these individual parcels, but will pollute the entire area. And unfortunately, despite this mass mobilization that has reached national attention, oil development has proceeded and expanded. One of the other cases that we spent a lot of time studying in the seminar is Nigeria, where geographer Michael Watts documents what he calls a slick alliance between Shell and the national government that has brought misery, violence, and a dying ecosystem to the Delta. Conservative estimates from the oil industry suggest that a minimum of 7,000 oil spills occurred between 1970 and 2000, although the real figure is more likely 2 or 3 times higher. Massive spills and flares have disrupted long-established subsistence fishing and farming practices. And in fact, the streams that are regularly used by the indigenous groups routinely register readings of petroleum hydrocarbons that are 360 and 680 times larger than the levels permitted by the European community. In addition to turning the Delta into what the World Wildlife Fund calls the most polluted place on the face of the earth, the oil industry has exacerbated existing social inequalities between ethnic majority and minority groups in the country, such that the United Nations estimates that between 1996 and 2002, the human development indices in the country's oil-producing states actually fell. Yet oil production in Nigeria has also produced staggering wealth. Nigeria is the 11th largest producer of crude oil in the world, and as Kay reminded us at the beginning of this seminar, 40% of that is destined to the United States. To say that oil dominates the national economy is an understatement. In 2007, over 87% of government revenues, 90% of foreign exchange earnings, 96% of export revenues, and almost half of gross domestic product came from oil. At $100 a barrel, that provides the government with $50 billion annually. 85% of these oil revenues, however, accrue to just 1% of the population. And the World Bank estimates that since 1960, when production first started, a staggering $100 billion of the $600 billion that had been produced has simply gone missing. Leaders of indigenous resistance groups, most notably Ken Saro-Wiwa, were summarily executed by the military, and violence continues to escalate dramatically in the Delta as youth militant groups increasingly fill a vacuum of political power and attempt to hold Shell accountable for its atrocities. Interethnic violence is also on the rise as communities attempt to secure the largest benefits from oil production. So these two cases are emblematic of increasingly prominent conflicts between indigenous communities and the agents of extractive industry. Together they raise a perennial and vexing question: why is it that resource-rich areas such as the Niger Delta and Ecuadorian Amazon oftentimes experience lower economic growth along with greater social and environmental costs when compared to regions without these resources? Political economists dub this contradiction the resource curse and theorize that weak state structures in the developing world are at the base of the problem. Studies such as those by Watts and Sawyer have refined this hypothesis by pointing to the active role of transnational corporations in bending state apparatuses to their will. So it just doesn't happen to be that we have weak state structures in these places. They're made to be weak. So this semester I'm teaching a seminar called The Anthropology of Energy here, and then also at the University of Colorado. And we've studied both of these cases, and students found it plausible that we could blame bad government for both of them, as states had abdicated their responsibilities for taking care of their own people in favor of cozying up with multinationals that would make the country's rich even richer. Their assumption, expressed in the few weeks of our class, was that no tragedy of this caliber could happen here in the United States because we had strict government regulations that would prevent such abuse. They were therefore surprised and disappointed when we turned our critical eye to our own country. They were horrified to learn of the effects of radiation on Native American communities that were unfortunate to be located near what would become uranium mines and nuclear testing sites. And they were shocked to read about Appalachian mountaintop removal mining and the dangerous working conditions faced by underground miners there. And this point was driven home just this last week as the worst mining disaster in this country in 25 years killed 25 miners in West Virginia. Many of them were really close to retiring. This news was really disturbing on its own, and it came a week after we lost over 30 people in China in an accident that was originally imagined to have killed over 150. And so coal mining typically enters the national imagination and public debate following events such as we just saw in West Virginia. And throughout the industry's history, public outcry has been absolutely essential in tightening safety regulations. In fact, it was the 2006 disaster that many of us remember at West Virginia's Sago mine that pushed Congress to strengthen the power of the Mine Safety and Health Administration to prevent the worst cases of corporate negligence. Over these past few days, however, we have all worried over the continuing presence of such atrocities as these in the face of increased regulation, especially as we learned about the increasing prevalence of mining companies contesting the fines and citations that they do get. So just to give you some numbers, even with the 2006 New Miner Act, which upped the limit that corporations could be fined, overall citations and fines from the Mine Safety and Health Administrations amounted to $100 million. If we take the profit from the companies that are just the 5 largest in the United States, their overall profit in that same year was over $12 billion. If we look at Massey, which is the company that operates and owns the mine that we just saw have the disaster, just this last year they were assessed $12.9 million in penalties, and their revenues were $2.3 billion. At the same time as our hearts and minds are focused on tragedies such as these, I don't want to forget our miners here in Wyoming and miss the opportunity to see what we can learn from the industry here. The men and women in our state have quietly and safely been producing a majority of the country's coal for the past 2 decades. There are both social and environmental explanations for the very different safety track records of the industry in these 2 places. And so in the talk today, I'm going to be focusing on the different kind of social contract that the corporations and communities created in the Powder River Basin, specifically where I did my research. But I did want to spend just a minute explaining some of the other factors behind the different safety records. The deadly explosions that happened both this week and then in 2006 in West Virginia were both believed to be triggered by a buildup of dangerous methane gases in the underground tunnels, which is the same methane that we now extract in our state for profit. So that's a big problem in underground mines, but not so much here in Wyoming, since most of ours are surface operations. Our primary safety concerns here revolve around the potential collapse of high walls and the operation of heavy equipment. At the same time that our safety records are admirable, with many of even the largest, most mind-boggling productive mines posting millions of man-hours worked without lost time accidents, I do want to take a moment to remember Alan Greger, Rich Rickardson, and Brad Beavers, who were all killed at work in the Powder River Basin coal mines in the past decade. At this conference, I've been inspired by our discussions about energy development right here in the state. Dr. Smutko opened the plenary panel by asking us to consider carefully how our decisions about energy development and our benefits from it affect those of us who are asked or expected to bear the burdens of that comfort. And our speakers at this conference have highlighted the importance of the social dimensions of environmental justice. So far, our considerations of this topic have focused on the burdens, challenges, and a few opportunities that rural citizens face in both oil and gas as well as wind development. So in this time today, what I'd like to do is build on those discussions in 2 ways. First, I'm going to examine coal mining, which is another major player here in this state that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about. And second, I'd like to join Professor Duff in drawing our attention to an often neglected social dimension of development, and that's the actual experience of workers in the industry. In particular, I'd like to use the experience of coal and coal bed methane development in Wyoming to speak to larger concerns about environmental and social justice that arise in the course of energy development. As we have already learned in this conference, and as I will touch again later, coal bed methane development has generally seemed to exhibit the worst of what we call a resource curse. Ranchers and their advocates across the state have exposed the environmental damage and social upheaval that has accompanied this most recent boom. And people like author Alexander Fuller, who's actually in town a couple of weeks ago, have heartbreakingly documented the dangerous working conditions that many roughnecks face on a second-by-second, shift-by-shift basis, as well as the strain that their work places on their families. At the same time, however, if we look at the state's coal industry, it seems to offer a much more positive case. So many of you may have seen Jeff Goodell in the news recently. He's a prominent public intellectual about the coal industry, and he is one of its staunchest critics, and even Jeff Goodell begrudgingly admits that Wyoming is different. He notes that miners don't come home with black faces, get black lung, or face the same safety threats that underground miners do. And while the coal industry is one of the largest contributors to climate change, even staunch critics admit that companies in the Powder River Basin have done a comparatively superior job of local reclamation efforts. Moreover, the state's permanent mineral trust fund is unique in the country for keeping at least some of the profits generated by these industries here in state. Many of our students attend college at very little cost, and money from mineral extraction has also built some of our most state-of-the-art facilities, from recreation centers to school. So how can we account for the sometimes dramatically different impacts of these two industries in a single state? I hope that by doing so we can learn some lessons about the Wyoming case and then link the international and local perspectives that I think have been so fruitful at this conference. So of course, I should frame my comments by being clear about my own entangled personal relationship with the Wyoming energy industry and how it shaped how I approach them academically as an anthropologist. I was born in Riverton in central Wyoming, where both my father and grandfather worked at mechanics in uranium. The mines were built on the hope of nuclear energy and collapsed along with the rest of the industry in 1982. We subsequently moved to Gillette, where my father found work fixing the gargantuan equipment at the large surface coal mines that were built to offer an all-American solution to the national energy crisis of the 1970s. While mining sets the rhythm of everyday life in the town, kids who grow up with parents who work at the mines actually learn very little about them unless they actually go work there themselves. So along with many of my peers, during summer vacations from college, I worked as a temporary summer student in production at 2 different mines. My first job was I worked in a production plant, and I was responsible for taking a giant fire hose and washing down all of the coal dust that had accumulated in all of the machinery. And then they eventually trained me to load the mile-long trains that we send out every day so they could take naps. And then my second job was driving haul trucks around in circles in the pits. What was interesting was I took my first job there the summer after I took my first anthropology course as an undergraduate. And so from the first step I took onto the mine site, I couldn't help but analyze everything I saw and experienced using an anthropological lens. Over those summer, my crew members adopted me as their own, even if it seemed a strange fit. After all, I was attending an incredibly liberal arts college and had developed a reputation for being a rabble-rousing feminist through many of my conversations with coworkers at the start of shift, on lunch breaks, and during off-site social gatherings. And my reputation reached new heights when I came back to work at the mines after spending a semester in Cuba. So my fellow crew members often teased me. They nicknamed me Lefty. They enjoyed me to listen to Rush Limbaugh on one of the few radio stations that reached the pit. This was before Sirius. And so while they often poked fun at and exaggerated my political leanings, they always respected my right to my own opinion, and they turned out to be some of my biggest, most unfailing supporters as I finished college and began graduate school. After all, the informal lesson that most miners hope the temporary summer students take home with them is not how to operate the equipment, but how to appreciate the importance of higher education. So throughout my employment at the mines, I developed close relationships with coworkers and an immense respect for the work they did on an everyday basis. And I became sympathetic to their impassioned critiques of how the coal industry was negatively portrayed in the national media, which, as we've said, tends to only cover the most catastrophic of human and environmental tragedies, leaving aside, for the most part, the many mines that produce coal with impressively safe records and environmental accolades. At the same time, however, I maintained a critical eye to some of the industry's labor and environmental practices, and I'll note that I did that along with many of my coworkers. After all, while the industry employees are quick to point out problems with the black eye that it's developed on a national scale and will be the first to defend it, they also are very aware of areas that need improvement. And so kind of everyone in the town engages in this balancing act of attempting to give the industry a fair shake while also examining it critically. And I engaged in that as well during my own graduate education, as I wrote a dissertation about gender, kinship, and labor in the Powder River Basin that I hoped would speak not only to my dissertation committee but also to the people back home. In that work, as well as in my continued research, I do my best to balance these multiple audiences and commitments by presenting the fairest possible appraisal of the industry, even if it often leaves both the industry's fiercest defenders and strongest critics frustrated that my work doesn't fit easily onto either side. So that's the caveat before we begin. So As most people know, Wyoming is the largest producer of coal in the U.S., providing approximately 40% of the coal burned in the nation's coal-fired power plants. At its peak in 2008, the state's approximately 5,000, keep that in mind, 5,000 miners produced 450 million tons of coal, a number that has dipped slightly since the recession. We do so courtesy of surface mines that boast large seams of coal that are located relatively close to the surface. Most of the large mines currently in production are located in the northeastern corner of the state, and all except for one were opened during the late 1970s and early 1980s on the heels of the national energy crisis that was sparked by the OPEC embargoes. This coal became increasingly attractive for utilities as environmental regulations stemming from the Air Quality Acts became stricter, since the region's low sulfur coal was an attractive option for power plants that needed to meet new standards but didn't want to invest in new technology. So if we look back to the 1970s, I think it's useful because we see that the criticism of the industry's historical labor and environmental practices framed the initial response to its expansion in the Powder River Basin. And we heard a little bit about this at this conference, but the key players were a coalition of local ranchers and then environmental groups that were really concerned about expanded development without regulation. And so they were advocating for regional rather than project-specific environmental impact statements, which is the document that the BLM and the mines have to produce before their permits can be approved. And their concern was that each permit was being approved on a mine-by-mine basis instead of by taking account what it looks like to have 14 of these giant mines operating at the same time. And that's the same problem that we currently face in the oil and gas industry, but it's even worse because they look at it on a well-by-well basis. So what we see is that in 1973 they sought an injunction against coal development in the area until such a comprehensive assessment could be made that met the requirements of the National Environmental Protection Act. At her testimony in the 1974 Project Independence hearings, sounds familiar to the time we are now, talking about energy independence, a key leader named Laney Hicks argued that ranchers would be hurt most of all by the rapid development. And she contrasted the renewable, sustainable dimensions of ranching with the finite gains of fossil fuel extraction, as you can read there. In January 1975, the U.S. Court of Appeals did issue an injunction against further development in the basin until the lawsuit was settled, which a lot of us have forgotten when we talk about the industry. The public reaction in Gillette and the rest of the state tended to be negative because they were concerned that the lawsuit was going to hinder them from taking part in this incredible economic opportunity. One of my favorite cartoons that I wasn't able to find for this presentation, unfortunately, was published in the Casper Star Tribune in July 1975. What it shows is a line of men with hard hats lined up at a stand called the Powder River Basin Unemployment Line. Off to the right, we see a man with a backpack that's marked Sierra Club, sitting cross-legged by a pool of water, lazily fishing. And a miniature Cowboy Joe, the official mascot of the University of Wyoming, asked him, "Got a dime so I can go fishing?" So this contrast, trying to portray the Sierra Club as a bunch of wealthy individuals who don't have anything better to do than to be interested in conservation, has since been captured by historian Richard White in the sentiment, in the phrase, "Are you an environmentalist or do you work for a living?" Which is interesting when you look at the coalitions that have been made in this state among ranchers who are productive users of the land and environmental groups such as the Sierra Club. What happened was in 1976 the Supreme Court lifted the injunction and the Department of the Interior went ahead and approved all of the permits that had been waiting. And although the lawsuit was unsuccessful in requiring regional impact statements, some of its concerns were integrated into the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977, which most of you are probably familiar with as SMCRA. It's a landmark piece of legislation that for the first time outlined the requirements for mitigating the environmental impacts of mining and reclaiming the land once mining had finished. And I think it's really inspiring that a group of concerned Wyoming citizens played a huge role in advocating and then achieving such a progressive piece of legislation. On a local level, the efforts of the coalition also compelled mining companies to address their concerns about the industry's environmental impact. So to win the goodwill of employees and communities alike, during their first years, company officials made efforts to present themselves as good neighbors, so they opened up all of the mines so people could just drive in and look at what they were doing there. They also donated generously to local organizations and causes. One of my neighbor's favorite stories is that the county was trying to build this huge kind of recreation complex that would include tennis courts, soccer fields, and baseball diamonds. And they were being slow, so the company he worked for sent all of their scrapers to town just to get it done. And so in addition to improving their environmental records, the other piece of the puzzle is that company officials explicitly sought to use the mines as an experiment in improving the industry's labor relations. So we tend to think about mining, we think about it as being historically one of the most militantly unionized industries in the country and the world. And so what the companies in the Gillette area wanted to do work without unions because they viewed them as being a hindrance to profit. But instead of trying to just behead the unions, they actually tried encouraging the workers to identify with the companies. So they offered them wages that were higher than any of the union contracts anywhere else in the country. They offered them grievance procedures that were taken word for word from other contracts. And they also kind of just showered gifts on miners. So they developed close relationships with coworkers and managers alike. And all of these activities created a sense of familial belonging at work and contributed to the mines enjoying some of the highest production levels of the industry. And so for the most part, this positive relationship among the company, the employees, and the communities has been maintained. High wages have enabled mining families to buy their own homes, live comfortable middle-class lives, send their children to college at this university, at expensive private ones that people don't understand why you would ever want to go there, and save for retirement. However, as the workforce has aged, there have been more complaints about carpal tunnel from shovel and dozer operators who they use joysticks all day long, like they're playing video games. And the equipment operators who are constantly jostled as they drive down haul roads. One of the biggest issues is the 12-hour shifts that all of them work, which stretch into 14, 15, 16-hour days when you start looking at commute times. And when the industry first started, the miners who worked there were all in their 20s. And so this wasn't a big deal. They said, yeah, we go drinking afterwards. You know, it's not that big of an issue. And then when you talk to them now in their 50s contemplating retirement, they echo the sentiment that one middle-aged miner said, man, back when I was just starting out here in my 20s, I could do anything. I was invincible. I didn't need to sleep, rest, nothing. I could work all day and then go out drinking and still get up for my shift. I can't do that anymore. One of his coworkers was even more blunt in saying these 12-hour shifts bring out the worst in everybody. You just turn into a grizzly. And at the same time that there are these health harms engendered by the 12-hour shift schedule and disruptions that happen in the miners' relationships with their families and the community, they really don't see a good option out because so many of them enjoy the 7 days off that they get every 28 days. So they get a week off every month because of the way the shift schedule is arranged. And kind of their sentiment is that if we're going to have to go out to the mine anyway, we might as well spend as much time as possible. That way we go out actually less days. The maintenance of a social contract has also rested on public approval of the industry's environmental practices. So mines in the basin have developed a reputation for engaging in cutting-edge reclamation techniques. A lot of times they collaborate with professors here at this university in developing strategies, especially for getting sagebrush to grow again and flourish, because even though it's really hardy once it's established, getting it established is really tough. Company employees, from equipment operators to environmental engineers, take pride in both particular projects and overall performance. Consultants who collaborate on compiling data and instituting programs also make glowing reports of the industry's activities, such as voluntary and expensive sage-grouse telemetry studies, careful relocation of birds and their nests, and alternative prairie dog habitats. They are saddened that not all of the habitats can be reclaimed exactly. For example, scoria breaks, sandstone bluffs, and gulches are nearly impossible to reproduce, but they do appreciate the overall efforts to return the land to its original purpose. So of course, it's not surprising that company employees and consultants express approval of the mine's reclamation efforts. For those of us who watched Crude on Wednesday night, we saw company employees from Chevron smiling and saying, I wouldn't work for this company unless we did good things, or unless we could point out when something went wrong along, and then we were shown all of the environmental destruction that has happened. So I think it's important to look at people who would otherwise criticize the industry and have reason to do so. So a woman I call Marie, as anthropologists we generally don't identify the people we work with, grew up on a ranch outside of Sheridan, and she frequently describes her lifelong relationship with one of the mines as twisted. As a teenager, the mine closest to their ranch started encroaching on her family's land, and the mining company began negotiations with her parents to buy the ranch so that the pit could advance. As she was showing me around their land one summer afternoon in 2007, she pointed to the pasture where they used to calve and said that it was not until 1984 when she really noticed the mine. She said the pit came so close that she could hear the haul trucks and backup alarms, and the bright light plants stayed on during the night shift. The thought of the mine destroying the ranch upset her greatly. She relished remembering her attempts to foil the mine's progress. Quote, "I used to take my horse and find all of the control points for the mine. I was smart enough in geometry that I'd pick up the stakes, move them 2 or 3 feet, and push them over. I did that routinely. I was an environmentalist railing against the inevitable." What happened was that the company that was seeking to buy her family's land offered her a summer internship, she believes, as a way of placating their family. But she realized that she originally was planning on being an interior decorator, and she thought that maybe that wasn't the most lucrative field. And so she found that she actually enjoyed the surveying and drafting. And so she said, "I started pulling up stakes and thinking for a 3-year period that the mines were wrecking the environment, that all this would be mine and it would ruin the ranch and the culture of the area. But by the time I was 22, I was a confirmed stronger proponent of mining, especially for women. There are a lot of opportunities for people willing to work hard, and our standard of living is high because of the industry." What she really appreciated learning that summer and through the rest of her career was that there was a plan to restore what had been disturbed, that capable, educated people would be in charge of those efforts, and that with SMACRA there would be constant regulation throughout the industry. So she earned a degree in civil and architectural engineering from here, and went on to work for an environmental consulting firm. And so this is where the strange twist of fate happens. The company eventually convinced her parents to sell the ranch, but it wasn't mined because it was declared an alluvial valley. But they did mine next to her ranch, and her consulting company was actually put in charge of the final bond release for that area. So during my field work, the final bond had just released, meaning that it had met all reclamation requirements to bring the land back into post-mine use for wildlife and grazing. She spent one afternoon showing me the reclaimed area, driving a pickup through the fields where she used to ride her horses as a teenager. She pointed out different species of grass and other vegetation, and took me to a reservoir that used to be a pit and is now a prime bass fishing place that she and her family visits every Father's Day. She was also happy to see that the bald eagles, bobcats, and coyotes were still frequenting the area. We watched a couple of bucks bound through the pasture, and she smiled with satisfaction, saying, "My dad would have loved to have pastured this good. I look at this, I'm a ranch kid, and I love it." So for her, the most rewarding part of her career has been seeing the land start as pasture, be mined, and then return to better pasture. So while she knows that it's possible to mine responsibly, she does continue asking herself the tough questions. She said, quote, "Laws are necessary. Some companies will be good stewards no matter what, but some won't be." She always asks herself, is the company responsible? Do I really believe that they're going to keep their promises? She views her responsibility as making sure that the areas she grew to love growing up as a ranch kid are properly reclaimed so they can go back to being enjoyed by local people and animals alike. So Marie's long and twisted, as she calls it, relationship with the mining industry is really unique. Not a lot of ranchers get to eventually supervise the reclamation of the area right around their own land that they love so much. But a lot of people have gone to work for the industry, especially in the environmental management side. But Marie's journey from vociferous critic to staunch supporter does demonstrate the importance of companies actually following through on their stated promises. Casting themselves as environmental stewards is convincing only as long as they actually engage in reclamation that meets the standards of people who know the land best. And what's important is that local ranchers and their advocates continue to hold the industry accountable to their stated commitments, along with the appropriate government agencies. So for example, right now they're currently raising concerns surrounding the rate of reclamation, the mine's impacts on local water sources, air quality and wildlife, and the industry's larger contribution to climate change. For instance, at a 2006 public hearing for a proposed lease that would extend the life of one mine, a woman who ranched next door pointed out the mistakes in the number of residences and wells on the maps and the environmental impact statement. She framed her statements in terms of how the mine would continue to impact her family, saying, "These things just jump out to me because they relate to me." To demonstrate the possible negative consequences of the proposed mine expansion, she showed this large collection of photographs on a big poster board of the orange clouds of nitrous dioxide that the mine's blasting activities had produced near her house. In concluding, she made a point to say that she had spoken not to hinder development, but simply to make sure it was done right. After she was finished, the mine official who was there at the meeting addressed her comments in a general manner, promised to investigate them further, and make sure that they were doing everything they could. When I approached her after the meeting to take a closer look at the pictures, she pointed to one large orange cloud and said, "This is what a good neighbor looks like." But moments such as these are comparatively rare in the basin, because not a lot of people make efforts to go to these sorts of meetings, and also because it's really difficult to get people on the record saying anything negative about it. Many locals only half-jokingly worry that if the industry were to shut down, Gillette would become another one of the ghost towns that are impossible to miss if you spend enough time driving along Wyoming highways. So it's very different when we compare how coal has developed in the Powder River Basin with how coal bed methane has developed there in the last 10 years. So as you know, coal bed methane is a natural gas that's stored in deep underground coal seams. CBM and other types of natural gas have been promoted as clean sources of electricity because their emissions are far less than those produced by coal. And we've seen this boom all across Wyoming. The promise of well-paying jobs has brought thousands and thousands of people to communities such as Gillette, Evanston, Pinedale. And I was in Gillette kind of at the height of the coal bed methane boom, and we couldn't find an apartment. People were living in RVs on the street. And it was impossible to go out to eat because everyone who normally would have taken a minimum wage job in the service industry had taken a job on the methane patch because they could make it more possible. So the booms have really brought a lot of social upheaval to people who live in town, but the group that has borne the biggest burdens from this development has clearly been ranchers, many of whom have maintained a continuous presence on the land since their families first homesteaded in the area 100 years ago. As we've heard in this conference from both community organizers and ranchers, the social and environmental disturbances which they must contend stem from a split estate property structure in which people own or lease the land that's on the surface but don't have control over the minerals or whatever is underneath. So they can't say no to development. Because minerals are the dominant estate, ranchers find themselves powerless to say no to leasing and eventual development of these minerals. In fact, one family that I know in the basin had actually put a bid on the minerals under their own land, thinking that if they bid on them, the companies would come in and try to develop it. And then they found that there was a law stating that if the minerals were developed in 10 years, that the contract would be dissolved and then it would once again go to bidding. So that wasn't a strategy, even though they had tried. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of the scope of this issue. So by 1996, since 1996, oil and gas companies have leased the mineral rights to 27 million acres of land in the Rocky Mountain West, with Wyoming shouldering the lion's share. In the last 10 years alone, oil companies have leased a fifth to a quarter of our state's land, which is 15.5 million acres, administered by the BLM, as well as hundreds of thousands of acres of national forest and private land. And what's concerning to ranchers up and down this Intermountain West is that oil and gas companies aren't subject to the same regulations that the coal industries are, especially with the 2005 Energy Act that exempted them from a number of regulations related to drinking water and air quality. So as we've heard in this conference, some of the most vexing issues concern water management. So to release the gas that's stored in these coal seams, you have to pump off the water that's on top of them. And so each well produces 5 to 20 gallons of water per minute. At 12 gallons per minute, which is kind of in the middle, one well produces over 17,000 gallons of water per day. This wastewater is higher in total dissolvable solids, including salt and sodium, which you can see on the edge of one of these reservoirs up here. Companies are required to make plans for responsibly discharging this water, and most often they do so by creating these large reservoirs, as re-injecting it back into the aquifer is expensive. Some have experimented with irrigating it to raise particular plant species that can actually tolerate the otherwise damaging levels of salt and sodium, because otherwise it harms most of the area's native grasses and shrubs. And in addition to disturbing the soil quality and health of the vegetation, ranchers are frustrated that this pumping disturbs natural artesian wells that they view as being like gold, since they provided for multiple generations of their family. Oil and gas development also disturbs large swaths of land. So unlike mining, which tends to be spatially distinct from ranching activities, CBM development happens on top of and next to regular ranching activities. They're on the same land. And what CBM brings with it are new networks of roads, pads, pipelines, power lines, transmission stations, and noisy compressors. And as such, companies are supposed to be careful around wildlife migration patterns and also during sensitive times on the ranch, such as calving season. And one of the most prominent areas of contention recently has surrounded sage grouse. So as a result of increased drilling, by 2010, its population declined 90% from its historic levels, and its habitat had shrunk by 50% and become fragmented, which caused the species to become a candidate for being listed as endangered. While environmental activists argued that the BLM's 2004 National Sage Grouse Conservation Strategy was insufficient, oil and gas companies and their supporters argued that they were overly stringent, and they cast the economic impacts of the issue as being more important than the environmental ones. And what was really interesting to me during this time was that there's not a large history of labor activism in Gillette. There was a big strike in the 1970s. But what we saw during all of these debates about sage grouse was a lot of roustabouts and roughnecks going out with big signs, protesting environmental regulations because they wanted to keep their jobs. Another area that has been impacted is human health, and I'd point you all to Ally McGraw's 2009 documentary, which is called Split Estate. It's really a fantastic documentation of a rash of illnesses that followed a drilling boom in Colorado's Garfield County, which is on the western slope. Residents experienced elevated levels of adrenal and pituitary tumors, headaches, nausea, joint pain, and respiratory problems and nervous damage. They found themselves in a bind as they knew that the drilling was making them sick, but they didn't want to move from the land that was equally a part of their family as any human members. Companies have not released the specific chemicals they use because they are proprietary information, making it difficult to document a causal link. We heard some of this yesterday also from ranchers in different parts of Wyoming. But despite all of these impacts, I think it's important not to make assumptions about how people feel about gas development from the beginning, because the situation on the ground is predictably messy and complex. So for example, I know ranchers who have welcomed the development because they get some money from the surface disturbance agreements. Other ones appreciate the new roads. Another guy that I know is excited because the drilling companies were going to use one of his existing reservoirs and re-water it. It had gone dry and he needed a place for his cattle. One longtime rancher who lived on his family's homestead with his own wife and children said that he had eventually taken work in town to support his ranching hobby. And so methane in a lot of ways has turned into another strategy to keep ranches afloat. And his mother, who's a well-respected figure in the community, echoed a common refrain when she said, "I don't have any problem with methane as long as it's done right." Her grandson toured me around their land where 3 generations were currently living. He pointed out all of the new roads that the companies had built and showed me where the huge power plant substation would eventually be located. The thing that bothered him the most was all of the traffic that is now on their ranch. Before, it was just his family and his neighbor's family that would use these county roads. And now they can't even count how many large trucks and other pieces of transportation go by and spit up dust throughout the day. But when we got back to his house, he said, "I have something to show you. I want you to listen to this." And he pulled out his great-grandmother's diary that she had kept when they had first moved to Wyoming. And he read her account of this hard summer in which all 4 girls were sick and they almost died. And he said, "This is just to give myself some perspective on how hard we think we've got it." Yet I think it's crucial to note that while it's true that ranching families have often relied on extra income from jobs in town or even at a mine to make ends meet, using income from disturbance agreements with oil and gas companies poses much graver damages. So if you work as a veterinarian or if you work as a coal mine operator, that doesn't make it impossible for you to ranch. But when CBM comes onto your land, oftentimes it makes the normal functioning of your ranch impossible. So what we see is that ranching families such as this one and others have faced difficulties in making sure development is done right. It takes time and energy to monitor company activity on their land. And this is really complicated because oftentimes there's a mismatch between the surface rights and the subsurface rights. So that you can have one lease here and 3 different mineral leases, which means that you potentially have to deal with 3 different companies all at the same time and having different agreements with all 3 of them. And so one woman was exhausted from trying to keep all of these different companies and their agreements straight. And she said, I have to spend at least 1 full day per week just handling those issues, and it's not like I have a lot of time on my hands. And so finally, in talking about the environmental and social impacts of CBM, I want to draw our attention also to the labor conditions in these places. Work on CBM rigs has proven to be extremely dangerous. Like miners, roughnecks work extremely long shifts from dawn to dusk, especially during the busiest times of the year. Yet most miners only work 3 or 4 of those shifts in a row. People who work out on the rigs work weeks in a row without a break, which contributes to increased fatigue and meth abuse both on the job and off, although companies all must comply with the regulations for drug testing, but only at the employee's initial hiring. At least 89 people died from 2000 to 2007 working in energy extraction in the Intermountain West, including 20 people alone in 2006 who worked in drilling or servicing wells. Wyoming shoulders one of the largest shares of these tragedies, as the state routinely tops the list of workplace fatalities in most years. And so following remarks that Professor Duff made earlier in this conference, I think we should also think about the toxins that many of these workers are exposed to as a part of their everyday activities, and also when they are brought in to clean up huge spills. We heard yesterday when there was a big blowout in the Bighorn Basin that a lot of the people they sent in as first responders didn't even have safety gear to do their work. One of the problems is that rig hands rarely see OSHA inspectors while at work unless there has been a fatality, because there are simply not enough of them in the state. In 2008, there were exactly 9 inspectors for the entire state, and 4 of them were located in Cheyenne, leaving 5 for the rest of the area. When companies are fined for using outdated, faulty equipment or failing to provide the basics of a safe workplace, they tend to be laughable. Famously, the company that the now legendary Colton H. Bryant worked for was fined a mere $7,031 for not providing adequate railing on the rig where he died, and that kind of railing would have cost $2,000 max. So, what do we learn by looking at these 2 different industries in the same state? The first point of difference and comparison that I'd like to point us to is in terms of corporate commitment. So when the coal industry specifically moved into Wyoming, they wanted to make an intentional effort to be different and clean up the industry's image. And tensions certainly still emerge both within mines and then between mines and communities. And while it's easy to be cynical and argue that these efforts were originally motivated purely by profit, I think it's important not to forget that they simultaneously ended up creating good things for the community as well. As such, it confirms what has often been called the business case for corporate social responsibility, which is that acting in a responsible manner can make corporations more profitable because they don't have to invest time or money into costly conflicts or disasters. And one of the reasons we haven't seen that same kind of commitment in the CBM industry is that the timescales are so different. Starting up and operating a coal mine requires almost infinitely more capital than drilling a rig. The equipment is expensive, so the largest dragline in the basin costs $50 million to construct, and there are about 10 of those. The haul trucks that they give to naive summer students, such as myself, who have no experience, cost $3 million a piece. And the fleets typically have, there are so many trucks that a fleet can easily reach $100 million. And my dad's a mechanic, as I mentioned, and his expertise is fixing loaders, and the loader that he's the most famous for fixing, the tires, costs 30 grand a piece. And that's just to start. So the mine also requires large office buildings on site, giant shops to house this enormous equipment, huge processing plants, and even larger silos for storing and then loading the coal onto trains. Sinking so much money into a single mine adds a sense of relative permanence to them, as companies simply cannot pull up stakes or move when the price of coal declines. All but the smallest mines continue operating during slumps in the market, although companies do typically lay off the temporary workers they have working there. And that's unfortunately happening right now in the recession. So rigs are certainly not cheap, but setting up a field of them is much less expensive when compared to a mine. You just cap them and move on. And we actually see this different commitment materially embodied in the community. A lot of the coal companies built their own giant offices and have a lot of their administration in Gillette. The CBM companies tend to lease random strip mall spaces for their operations. People say they're still Texas companies. And I think also looking at the workforce, the miners who've been living in Gillette have been there for the last 30 years. And people who work with the oil industry typically have to move around a lot. And we also see different environmental engagements. As I explained before, coal is many environmentalists' worst nightmare because it's so intensive. But CBM is actually more concerning to a lot of people in the area because it's more extensive. It covers more land. And then finally, the different regulations that I talked about, SMACRA versus the lack of regulations for the oil and gas. So to conclude, I think when we're thinking about green energy, I want us to consider energy networks and an expanded definition of green. Not just to look at the environment, but as prominent activist Van Joan argues, the health of communities, workers, and their families. This is especially important for debates about energy, which tend to focus on local environmental impacts, as well as global climate change at the expense of examining the human element inside these industries. I was actually depressed this week to read an article posted by Newsweek in which experts argued that the coal mine accident in West Virginia isn't going to affect national debates about energy use in the U.S. with coal because disasters such as these fade from national consciousness when the next big news story happens. There's a larger problem, though. When we're discussing the incident, Mr. Bill Wicker, who's the communications director for the Senate Energy Committee, said, quote, "This is a mining accident. This issue involves the health and safety of our miners, not our energy future. Something is seriously wrong when debates about our energy future do not include consideration of the health and safety of the people who work there." And I would humbly point out that many of these questions are not limited to mining, but when we start thinking about even things like wind, we should think about what it's like being a mechanic who services those turbines and the people who work in the factories assembling them. So this approach requires making visible crucial nodes of energy product networks that are otherwise obscured when we buy electricity anonymously from power companies without knowing exactly where it comes from. And so I think a crucial first step in bringing about meaningful change must be engaging in a politics of visibility that connects the dots between the people and places who produce energy and those who consume it. So for example, many of the students in the energy seminar were horrified to learn about Nigeria and how much they support Shell every time they fill up their car. And so once we went through all this material, they started thinking differently each time they filled up their car. But at the same time, we know that knowledge isn't enough, and so they cringe every time they put their credit card in there, but we don't have a lot of alternatives for transportation. And so I'm looking forward to discussing some of Chris Payne's work about activism about electric cars with them later in the week. So as we have learned, the visibility of product networks is a particularly significant issue for people in Wyoming who do see the power plants, the railroads, the infrastructure, the workforce, and the support industries necessary for producing vast quantities of coal and natural gas. We know that it requires daily adjustments by entire families to the seemingly most mundane of activities, such as rearranging meal times around a shift worker so that parents and children can eat together, or strategically scheduling social activities so that busy children do not disrupt their parents while they're attempting to sleep during the day. And at this conference, we heard firsthand that ranchers such as Marge West, Deb Thompson, and John Fenton see, smell, hear, and even taste the effects of drilling on land that generations of their families have nurtured. Yet this knowledge rarely extends outside of the coal and natural gas communities or energy insiders, frustrating local workers who view themselves as providing a valuable service for the country. So what a lot of people have said to me in my fieldwork and also here at this conference is that they wish people would realize where their energy was coming from when they flick on a light and use electricity. And so I think this call for recognition is an appeal to what anthropologist Robert Foster calls caring from a distance, which is recognizing the moral relations and ethical responsibilities implicit in the movement of products from one set of hands to another. And I think it is precisely this acknowledgement that should inform our current debates about our shared energy future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. And we have time for a couple of questions, if there are any from the audience. Mountain Range legislation and how it got passed, and why is it harder to protect other regions in Wyoming?
I'm not as familiar with that legislation that you mentioned. I think what happened in the 1970s was that we had a trump card, and so we had some leverage when we were making debates with the coal companies. And I guess I'm not exactly sure why that hasn't happened with oil and gas. I think there have been larger pressures from the federal government to support that industry, so it's been more difficult to critique it on a state and local level.
I just want to mention that the whole thing because the government actually was subsidizing people coming in and spraying and drill. So they were getting not only money from, and at that point, gas was a much lower level of shop. And number two, in the union system as well, the barriers to entry and economic subsidizing is a big plan. There's a huge barrier for somebody else to come in and compete. Instead of something where you have a negotiation person coming in there. So coming into the CDM, really, you want to be kind of a small part to come in the initial stage and start really to be a much bigger than sort of so that's a very strange. Yeah. Thank you.
Another question before we end? All right, thank you, Dr. Smith. We have something for you quickly. Our little goodie bags. I think I was reaffirmed hearing from Dr. Smith that knowledge gives us hope. So now that we're reaffirmed with our understanding of what's happening in Wyoming, that we can move on to do better things. In our bag is the Meaning of Matthew, which is Judy Shepard's book about her son Matthew Shepard, for which the symposium is named after. It's also signed by Mrs. Shepard. One of the elusive Hobbs School water bottles with our new logo on it, and a mug with our old logo on it. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to end with a quote before we introduce the Collegiate Chorale and Dr. Nicole Lamartine. Gandhi said it best when it says, "Be the change you want to see." So, yeah. At last year's symposium, the University of Wyoming Collegiate Chorale and members of the University of Wyoming choirs encircled the keynote of the audience with song. This year, the Collegiate Chorale, conducted by UW Assistant Professor Nicole Lamartine, who is also a member of the Shepherd Symposium Steering Committee, offers 3 short pieces on this year's theme of eco-justice. The first piece is entitled Earth Song by Frank Kelly, and explores the notion that among the tumult of the earth and practices of the people on it, that we sing, live, and be for peace. After the tsunami in 2004, Austin singer-songwriter Eliza Gilkinson wrote the next piece, Requiem, as an expression of wonder about how the earth, in this case, Mother Mary, provides all that we need, but also can take it all away. She asks through this song that we find grace as a people on the planet. The Collegiate Chorale will close with a Shaker hymn, Not One Sparrow is Forgotten, reminding us that Earth provides us all that we need, and among all of its inhabitants, we are never forgotten. Please help me welcome UW Collegiate Chorale with Lisa Rickard on the piano under the direction of Nicole Lamartine.
To be of the earth is to know the restlessness of being a seed, to know the darkness of being planted, to know the struggle toward light and the pain of growth into the light. To be of the earth is to know the joy of bursting and bearing fruit. center of the earth, there is a mother. If any of us who are her children die, she feels a grief like a wound deeper than any of us can imagine. She puts her hands to her face and her fingers press into her eyes. Our mother is somber. She is thinking. She puts her big ear against the sky to comfort herself. Do this, she calls to us. Do this. We join with the earth and with each other.
We join with the earth and with each other.
To bring new life to the land, to restore the waters, to refresh the air, to renew the forests, to care for the plants and to protect the creatures, to celebrate the seas, to rejoice in the sunlight, to sing the song of the stars. We join with the earth and with each other. Not one sparrow is forgotten, neath the raven God will feed, and the lily of the valley from his bounds she hath his need. Then shall I, God's trusty Father, in thy mercy have a share, and through faith and prayer, my mother, merit thy protecting
All I can say is what an incredible way to end. Thank you, Dr. Lamartine and the Collegiate Chorale. Two last announcements. One is we hope you will join us tonight for the Equality Dance. One more time I will plug it to the Matthew Shepard Foundation and the Shepard Symposium. It will be in this very room, so it will be easy to find. It will start at 8 o'clock, and you will see much of the steering committee out there dancing. So if you want a good smile and also some time to celebrate the work that we have done here, hopefully it will not stop here. We have one final action for you to do, and that's to recycle your name badge holder. Remember, it's every little step. There are boxes in here, this one, and then there are also boxes out near the stairway and also at the registration table. So we would encourage you to take out your name badge, the actual piece of paper, and recycle it in the bins that are around, and then put the actual plastic holder in boxes that look like this or larger boxes. Thank you again to the committee. What a wonderful job we did this year. And have a great rest of the semester, and we look forward to seeing you in 2011. Thank you.